What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo to deliver you the final part of the What Makes a League Winning series. You guys asked for tight ends. I didn't think you guys were going to want me to do tight ends, but I'm a man of the people, so I had to deliver. What we're going to be doing today, if you guys haven't seen any of the other videos, I will link all three of them in the description. You can go check those out. Very valuable information in there if you haven't seen them. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be determining who are the league winning tight ends this year in fantasy football. How can we spot who those league winning tight ends are? And basically, this will be a comprehensive guide on how to approach the tight end position in your draft this upcoming summer. With the running backs and wide receivers, I focus more on the early round guys. And then with the quarterbacks, I focus more comprehensive. This one will be a lot more closely related to the quarterback position because there's not that many that are valuable in fantasy. So what we're trying to determine here is who has the ceiling, who has too much risk, who doesn't have a very high ceiling, who's more of a safer pick. And as always, guys, we need to weight all factors: volume, situation, talent. All of it matters, as we discussed in the running backs, wide receivers, and quarterbacks. The more boxes a player can check, the higher the ceiling, the higher their floor, and the higher the chances that they can win you a fantasy championship. And as always, guys, we're on the road to 5,000 subscribers. If you haven't already hit subscribe, what are you waiting for? Totally free to do so. And I promise you, we will win you a fantasy championship this upcoming year. So if you haven't already done so, hit that subscribe button. Comment any of your league punishment ideas down below. You guys know we're running a special contest, probably going to end around early August. So comment any of those thoughts down below, guys, and you will win a guaranteed spot into our listener league, as well as a free draft guide and another thing that we're going to announce, shortly as well. So we're going to hit the intro and then we're going to get right into this. Just like we did for quarterbacks, we're going to define who we're talking about. What did it take for one of those true elite difference-making tight end ones? Basically, when you owned these guys, you were laughing at the people streaming tight ends, because if you had these guys, they were in your lineup week in and week out. You didn't have to worry about this position. And we all know that tight end is one of the, probably definitely the most shallow position in fantasy football, and not one of those positions that you want to be streaming if you want a chance to win a championship, because this position is very top heavy. So 2020 to 2014, I looked at players who averaged 11 half PPR fantasy points per game. So 11 seems like an arbitrary cutoff based on my own judgment. But when I looked at the players, and especially this year, when we take this year, for example, Mark Andrews averaged 10.2 fantasy points last year. So if you were a bit better than Mark Andrews, then you were qualifying for this list. And it was, again, basically based on my own judgment. I thought that 11, based on the amount of time I've been playing fantasy football, was the cutoff for these elite guys. And I chose half PPR to balance out touchdowns versus volume tight ends, because if I chose full PPR, then the guys who are touchdown scorers might not necessarily make a big impact versus the guys that got a high target volume. So again, that's why I chose 11 half PPR fantasy points. And again, if you guys have seen the other three videos, you know what's coming next. You're a true OG if you're watching this fourth video, and you know that we're going to go over the volume-based factors first. And you guys can see there were 30 tight ends that fit this description. On the screen right now, you will see all of them from 2020 to 2014. And again, if you missed the other videos, a green, if they have a color green, it means that they were above average among these elite options. Yellow means that they were about average, and red meant that they were below average. And these guys were all correlated, right? So you could see a guy like Travis Kelce, for example, in 2019. He didn't have the touchdowns necessarily, but he made up for it with the targets and the receptions. And vice versa is also true. In 2019, Mark Andrews didn't have the targets or the receptions, but he did have the touchdowns. Usually you need one or the other to be an elite tight end in fantasy. And one thing I'd like to point out is just look back at the awesomeness of Travis Kelce. You see 2020, he was on this list. 2019, he was on this list. 2018, he was on this list. 2017, he was on this list. And 2016, he was on this list. Again, 5 straight years finishing as the tight end one and being an elite difference-making tight end. And not only that, but 2020 and 2018 Travis Kelce are the best of these 30 tight end seasons. And he did that, twice in the last 3 years. So, and that's better than anything Gronk did in this period of time. That's better than anything that Zach Ertz did in this period of time. It's better than anything that Jordan Reed did in this period of time. All these elite options, Travis Kelce is the most elite out of all these guys, which is really impressive to see. Let's go to the averages now. The averages of these players are easier to digest. You can see that on average, these guys average 7.83 targets per game, 5.42 receptions per game, and 0.55 touchdowns per game. And on a 16-game pace, that's 125 targets, 87 receptions, and 9 touchdowns. And that seems pretty intimidating when you think about it. It's like, to be one of these elite guys, you needed to be like those numbers are basically wide receiver 2 numbers. And that's tough for tight ends to achieve, especially those 125 targets. There's only like 2 tight ends last year that got that much volume. And it was Darren Waller and Travis Kelce. So that's why you can see on the chart that 2020 only produced 2 of these guys, which was Travis Kelce and Darren Waller, which makes sense. So let's look at the situational factors. And I would say these matter a lot more because with the tight end position, because it is so shallow, you can get an every week starter, sometimes purely based on situational factors. Because when we think about a guy like Logan Thomas or Robert Tonyan last year, for example, they were like top 5 tight ends in fantasy. They weren't necessarily achieving this full resume of elite tight end production. Logan Thomas had a lot of targets. That's why he did it. And Robert Tonyan had a lot of touchdowns, and that's why he did it. And that's how these situational factors can play into what makes these good tight ends for fantasy. And obviously those guys didn't necessarily make this list, but they were every week starters for your fantasy team. So when we look at the situational factors, we can start with the obvious ones, offensive rank in points per game and quarterback rank in QBR. As I mentioned for the other videos, we want players that are in good offenses, and we want quarterbacks that are good at football throwing our fantasy players the ball. That's pretty self-explanatory to me. When you look at who had good offenses and who had bad quarterback play, there's not that many players on this list that had bad quarterback and bad offenses. It looks like George Kittle, Martellus Bennett, and Greg Olsen are the only guys that had both, where they had a quarterback that maybe underperformed as well as having an offense that wasn't very good. And these were the more important ones that I wanted to dig into. When we look at rank and team targets, rank and receiving touchdowns, to me, I wanted to know what with tight ends, do you need to be a primary target on your offense? And I think that's very important, especially for a guy like Noah Fant this year, right? Because Noah Fant is a very young, talented tight end, but he has Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton ahead of him on the depth chart in terms of how many targets he's going to get. And that to me is really scary for Noah Fant, because in order for him to achieve this elite tight end ceiling, can he do it with those guys there? Because I would argue that he can't, because rank and team targets, rank and receiving touchdowns, when you dig further into this list, you can see that only 3 of these tight ends, of these 30 tight ends, were not first or second on their team in terms of targets among receiving options. And then only 3 of 30 were not either the best touchdown scorer or the second best touchdown scorer on their offense as well. So in terms of, hog rate and production premium, basically the percentage of your team's receiving targets and receiving touchdowns, as a tight end, to be an elite option, you basically need to be the best option on your offense or the second best option on your offense. And as you see, when we get into this year's tight ends, that's going to affect some people a lot, as I mentioned with Noah Fant. So the last 2 that I wanted to measure was inline percentage. And now, if you guys are new to fantasy, or if you're maybe more casual players, you probably won't know this, but inline percentage is basically when you're an inline tight end, you're attached to the offensive line, which means that you're going to be either blocking or running a route. And in fantasy, we want tight ends that are not in line. We want tight ends that are split out wide, split into the slot. For example, Travis Kelce only played 37% of the snaps in line last year, and that's about the career average of what Travis Kelce plays. He's usually out wide or in the slot or sometimes in the backfield or lined up at fullback or something like that. We don't want tight ends in line, because more often than not, that means they're going to be blocking and not running routes. And we want them obviously running routes in order to catch passes. So inline percentage is something that I wanted to test to see if these elite tight ends were guys that were used all over the formation. They weren't just stuck at, Y tight end, and they weren't used in a variety of ways. And then ranking yards per route run, again, pretty self-explanatory. It's usually a measure of efficiency, usually a measure of talent. So more or less, that was just, were they talented players that year? Were they one of the best tight ends in the NFL that year? And for the most part, you could see that they definitely were, given the fact that the tight end position is a shallow position. You should rank pretty highly in this if you're one of the best tight ends in fantasy that year. So let's go to the averages of the situational factors. As always, you can see 11 offensive ranking points per game. So you needed to be a top 11 offense on average, top 10 quarterback, pretty much playing quarterback for you as a tight end, ranking team targets and ranking receiving touchdowns. As I mentioned, 1.47 and 1.5. So on average, these guys were about the second best target in their offense, 1.5 best target in their offense. And inline percentage, like I mentioned with Kelce, 37%, ranking yards per route run. Basically, you needed to be a top 5 tight end in the NFL, in real NFL. And that probably meant you made like the Pro Bowl or something like that. And again, on the inline percentage, 25 of the 30 tight ends on this list were under a 50% snap share lined up as an inline tight end. And these 5 players were Kittle twice in the from 2019 to 2018, Darren Waller this year, Tyler Eifert in 2015, and Austin Hooper in 2019. And when you look at all those situations individually, Kittle and Waller, 3 of those 5 seasons, were the clear number one target in their offense. So that makes sense why they were able to play in line more. Tyler Eifert scored 13 touchdowns that year. So that, again, makes sense why he was able to play in line more. And Austin Hooper played 13 games, but also was scoring a lot of touchdowns. And the Falcons threw the ball like 680 times in 2019. So generally speaking, we want our tight ends to not be in line over 50% of the time as a general rule of thumb. And when we think about yards per route run, again, you need to be one of the best tight ends in the NFL from an efficiency standpoint to be great in fantasy, because generally speaking, tight ends usually don't get that many targets. There's 3 or 4 tight ends every year that get over 100 targets, and the rest of the tight ends that finish 5, 6, 7 in fantasy are usually guys that are, hovering around 70 to 90 targets. Someone like Mark Andrews, for example, this year. So let's go over the tight ends this year in ADP. How can we use this information? That's what the point of this video is. How can we use this information to determine who's going to be good for fantasy this year? So we're going to start with the top 1 to 8 tight ends in ADP per Underdog Fantasy, as we did for wide receivers, as we did for quarterbacks, as we did for running backs. We're going to go over these guys individually. And you can see the very obvious fact of the top 3 tight ends are more elite than the other guys is pretty true. I think the most important thing to take away from this, of these top 3 guys, is that George Kittle is a touch below Travis Kelce and Darren Waller. And obviously, Travis Kelce probably is a touch ahead of Darren Waller as well. But when you look at George Kittle, we have some concerns with George Kittle, right? We can see that touchdowns have not been a thing that George Kittle has thrived in to this point in his career. Now, that might change with Trey Lance if he's a great quarterback, but George Kittle is not a guy that has scored a lot of touchdowns historically in his career. Despite being a great actual life tight end, he hasn't scored a lot of touchdowns. He's racked up the yards, racked up the catches, but the touchdowns have not been there for him quite yet. So that's something that is yet to be seen with him. And then when we look at his rank and team targets, we expect him to be a top 2 option on his team, but you guys know how much I love Brandon Ayuk. I am not willing to say that George Kittle definitively is going to out-target Brandon Ayuk, maybe even Deebo Samuel for that matter. So I think definitively George Kittle is a top 2 target on that offense, but I do think Ayuk gives him a run for his money, which is why I can't definitively say, like Darren Waller and Travis Kelce, that he's going to be the top target on his offense, because I don't see Tyreek Hill out-targeting Travis Kelce anytime soon, because he hasn't done it in his career. I don't see Henry Ruggs or, John Brown out-targeting Darren Waller, because Darren Waller just gets so much volume in that offense. So that is why I favor those top 2 guys over George Kittle, in my opinion, and why I think there should be about a round discount from Darren Waller to George Kittle in terms of ADP. And those guys are pretty much going back to back, which is why I don't own a lot of George Kittle this year. And when we get to the next tier of tight ends, these 4 to 6 guys, Kyle Pitts, you can see, has a lot in his favor, really, because as a top 5 overall pick, we expect him to get the targets and the receptions, because he really only has to compete with Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley is going to get 150, 160 targets this year. And if the Falcons throw the ball 600 times, which I would say is a conservative projection, considering how much they've thrown it in the past, but if they throw the ball 600 times, we give Calvin Ridley 160 targets. That's like that's over a 25% target share. I think that's probably about what Calvin Ridley is going to receive. We can easily carve out 20% of the targets, which would be about 125, which is exactly what we need in terms of a 16-game pace for Kyle Pitts. And I think being a top 5 overall pick, Julio Jones no longer there, Russell Gage and Olamide Zaccheaus is his biggest target competition. I think 125 targets is a reasonable projection for Kyle Pitts. It's not a ceiling projection. I think he could legitimately get 130, 140 targets as a ceiling, but 110, 120, 125 is about what I expect for Kyle Pitts as a rookie. And yes, as a rookie tight end, I do expect him to put up that kind of numbers. And the really great thing about Kyle Pitts is when you look at the inline percentage, we've seen Arthur Smith deploy Jonnu Smith and Anthony Firkser a lot in the slot. Anthony Firkser led NFL tight ends last year in slot percentage. He led NFL tight ends last year in the lowest amount of time that he was in line. He was in line like 14% of the time. So if Kyle Pitts, and he definitely is as versatile as Anthony Firkser and Jonnu Smith, then he's going to be deployed in a variety of ways. He's going to be deployed in the slot, out wide, in the backfield, because he's their second best receiver on their team. And you could make the argument that he might even be as good as Calvin Ridley already. So Kyle Pitts is a guy that it really checks a lot of boxes, despite being a rookie tight end. That rookie tight end stigma doesn't hold as much weight for me, because I don't expect Kyle Pitts to be in line 85% of the time like TJ Hawkinson and Noah Fant were as rookies. I expect him to be deployed much more like a wide receiver because of what we've seen from Arthur Smith and because of the skill set I saw at Florida from Kyle Pitts, where he was already deployed that way in college. So Mark Andrews, the next guy that we're going to talk about here, he has targets and receptions are going to be a question mark for him, because as much as I expect the Ravens to take a step forward in terms of how much they're going to pass the ball, Rashad Bateman's coming to town, Sammy Watkins, Tylan Wallace, there suddenly is more competition for targets than there's ever been for Mark Andrews. And I don't expect him to reach that 125 target potential because without those guys, he was still only a 100 target tight end. So that's fine for Mark Andrews, but we know he can put up double-digit touchdowns. We know he's done it before. We know he can do it again. So that's why I gave him a green yes there. And then when we look at his situational factors, I mean, he has a great quarterback. As much as people want to rip on Lamar Jackson, he's still a top 15 quarterback in the NFL, top 10, top 5 quarterback at best when you account for what his efficiency because of his rushing accounts for. And then in terms of the offense, it's going to be a great offense this year. Ranking team targets, like I said, he's probably going to be a top 2 target in the offense this year. But I think one of Rashad Bateman, Sammy Watkins, whoever, gives him a run for his money with the number 1 target in the offense this year. And ranking receiving touchdowns, I would say he's the odds-on favorite to lead the team in receiving touchdowns pretty comfortably. In line percentage, again, this is a guy that does not play in line. He plays in the slot. He plays out wide. And he plays in line about 20% of the time, which was amongst the best for these 30 elite tight ends that I talked about from 2014 to 2020. Mark Andrews in 2019 played 20% of the time in the in line as a blocking tight end. So great usage out of Mark Andrews there. I don't expect that to change anytime soon. And then ranking yards per route run, we know he's a very talented tight end, but not quite maybe to the talent of George Kittle, Darren Waller, Travis Kelce, and I think even Kyle Pitts, even as a rookie tight end. So TJ Hawkinson, another guy that I'm really high on this year. If you guys have our draft guide, you know that I'm very high on him. Targets, receptions, and touchdowns, he checks all the boxes. He's going to be probably the leading target on that team. The only real question mark we have is DeAndre Swift might out-target him. Like, that is like legitimately his biggest competition for targets is his running back. And when we think about what they lost in the offseason, they lost Kenny Golladay. They lost Marvin Jones. They have, Rashad Perriman and Amon-Ra St. Brown as their top 2 receivers. It's going to be tough for anybody to out-target TJ Hawkinson. And that 125 targets is very achievable for TJ Hawkinson. And I would argue he has 130, 140 target potential, just like Kyle Pitts does, because of the lack of targets in that offense, because I think the defense is going to be bad still, and they're going to have to throw the ball at a decent clip still. And then ranking team targets, ranking receiving touchdowns. I expect TJ Hawkinson to lead this team in both receiving targets and receiving touchdowns. Obviously, the offense probably won't be a top 15 scoring unit or anything close to that because Jared Goff isn't that great of a quarterback. The Lions aren't going to be that good of an offense, but I do think they're going to be about the 20th best offense in the league. I don't think this is going to be a dumpster fire 32nd best offense in the league New York Jets situation. I think they have talent on that team. They have one of the better offensive lines in football, and Jared Goff is a capable quarterback. He's not a bad quarterback. So with good protection, half decent weapons, I think they can put up like the 20th best offense in the league, which isn't terrible for TJ Hawkinson. And then inline percentage, he's about 50%, 45%, I think last year for TJ Hawkinson. I gave him a yes on that front, but not, a convincing yes. And then ranking yards per route run, he was amongst the top tight ends in yards per route run last year. He's a very talented tight end entering his 3rd season in the NFL. Dallas Goedert, I'll keep this one a little bit quicker. We don't really know what his targets and receptions are going to be. Once Zach Ertz leaves, that might clear up a little bit. So he might have that 125 target potential, but he still has to compete with Devontae Smith, even Jalen Reagor and Travis Fulgham, some of the other guys that are there. So target potential is probably a little bit capped for Dallas Goedert because they suddenly do have some guys to throw to in Philadelphia. Touchdowns have not really been a huge strong suit of his. Plus, I don't expect Jalen Hurts to throw a bunch of touchdowns either. So it's pretty hard to project Dallas Goedert for 9 touchdowns if Jalen Hurts only throws 23 of them or something like that. So that'll be a bit tough, but I do expect him to probably be among the team leaders in touchdowns, probably competing with Devontae Smith. Team targets, the same thing. Probably competing with Devontae Smith for targets, but probably the second target in this offense. And then offensive rank in points per game, quarterback rank. I don't personally believe in Jalen Hurts that much as a quarterback. So I don't think this offense is going to be much better than like the 18th best offense in the league at best. And then at worst, like probably the 25th, 28th best offense in the league. So Dallas Goedert's got a little bit muddier of a situation, but he is probably the clear second target in that offense. Maybe even the first target if Devontae Smith struggles. Inline percentage, this is a guy, unfortunately, that does block a fair amount. So he's not out on routes as much as we want him to. And I don't think that changes even if Zach Ertz is gone. I think Dallas Goedert maybe even blocks a little bit more if Zach Ertz is gone because he's their primary inline tight end. And Zach Ertz actually is the guy that they split out into the slot and out wide. So a little bit of bleak news for Dallas Goedert there, but I still think he's a fine option in the 8th round or whatever. Tyler Higbee, again, kind of similar thing. The one thing that is I'll say about Tyler Higbee that is really concerning is the fact that he is not the second or first target in his offense. Those 2 receivers ahead of him are going to out target him. That's a virtual guarantee. They would pretty much need to get injured for Tyler Higbee to be any better than the third target in that offense, but you could see this offense is going to be good. They can definitely support a third target, especially when it's a tight end in Tyler Higbee. And now that they lost Cam Akers for the year, you could expect that they're probably going to lean on their passing game a lot more than they might have if Cam Akers was fully healthy and shouldering the workload on the ground. So I spend a lot of time on the top 8 tight ends, but I mean, that makes sense. They're the better tight ends, tight end options. And I touched on Noah Fant already. Let's get through tight ends 9 to 16. I'll go a little bit faster on these guys, but Noah Fant does not check a lot of boxes other than talent, which is the biggest takeaway of this entire exercise for me, is that Noah Fant might not be that good of a fantasy pick this year because he's not going to get the targets. He's not going to get the receptions because he has Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy to compete for targets with. And then when you look at how good the offense is going to be, it's not going to be very good. How good is Drew Lock or Teddy Bridgewater going to be? Not very good. His rank in team targets, his rank in receiving touchdowns, he might lead this team in touchdowns, but receiving targets, he absolutely will not be first or second ahead of those top 2 receivers. And then inline percentage, again, he is a guy that played amongst the league leaders in inline percentage at tight end. And we hope to see him used in a more versatile role because we know he's a freakish athlete for the position. But from what we've seen so far, Noah Fant might not be that great of a fantasy pick because this is the guy that doesn't really have that high of a ceiling outside of his own physical potential. Obviously, he has the ability to break away long plays because he's that freakish of an athlete, but the targets, the offense, that everything is kind of pointing against Noah Fant. And I think for that reason, he's probably going to be a guy that's capped at like tight end 5, tight end 6 in terms of his overall ceiling, because I don't think he can ever get 110, 120, 130 targets because of those top 2 receivers and because of the quarterback play that he's dealing with. And then Logan Thomas, he has question marks all over the place: targets, receptions, in-line percentage, receiving touchdowns, team targets. Everything about his role should change this year with the additions of Curtis Samuel, with Antonio Gibson coming into his second year, probably making a bigger leap in the passing game, and De'Ami Brown being drafted in the 3rd round. I don't think we're going to see the same usage out of Logan Thomas, which was very good last year. He was used a lot in the slot. He was targeted heavily, but I don't think that's going to keep up this year. I think that was out of necessity because they threw the ball a lot, because they couldn't get a lot going on offense, and they didn't have a lot to throw to outside of Terry McLaurin. So they were forcing the ball to J.D. McKissick and Logan Thomas, who had really done nothing in their NFL careers prior to last season. So he's not a guy that I'm really going to be targeting in drafts this year. Mike Gesicki, same thing. With all the weapons that they brought in Miami this year, I don't think he's going to be a very highly targeted guy. He's ranked well in yards per route run, but the targets, the offense, the quarterback play, none of it really inspires a lot of confidence in me to draft Mike Gesicki where he's currently going, which is pretty high, still considering that I thought he would drop a lot more, considering the additions of Will Fuller and Jalen Waddle and Tua coming into his second year, still not quite the quarterback that we saw at Alabama. And then Irv Smith, a guy that was a very popular breakout candidate for me, for Danny, for a lot of people in the industry. But again, when you look at it, he's not going to be the first or second target on this offense. It's going to be Jefferson. It's going to be Thielen ahead of him. And then the same goes for touchdowns. Those guys are red zone options. They will score in the end zone. And the quarterback rank in points per, the quarterback rank in QBR and the offensive rank in points per game should be there. There should be a good offense, especially considering you have Dalvin Cook and Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen ahead of them, commanding work. But the volume and the consistency is going to be tough for Irv Smith to achieve because he's like the 4th option in that offense behind the running back and the 2 receivers. So he is a guy that is going to be a streamer, and a good streamer probably, because he has a high ceiling because of his ability, but it's going to be tough for him to be consistent because of what he has ahead of him on the depth chart. Robert Tonyan, I just assumed Aaron Rodgers would be the quarterback, so he's going to be a complete fade for me if Aaron Rodgers isn't there. But if Aaron Rodgers is there, you have one of the best quarterbacks in the game, one of the best offenses in the game, a guy that can be second on the team in touchdowns, definitely not ahead of Devontae Adams, and a guy that did play in the slot and out wide. So a guy that is going to be interesting if Aaron Rodgers plays. But again, we don't know if Aaron Rodgers is going to play this year. And then we go to Adam Troutman, a guy that has a lot of question marks, and mainly that who's going to play quarterback, how good is the offense going to be, and how many targets this guy going to get? Because he had 300 yards as a rookie last year. I don't expect him to suddenly get 130 targets. To me, he's a guy that's capped at 60, 80 targets because Kamara and Thomas are the primary guys in this offense. And if Taysom Hill's the starting quarterback, I don't expect him to throw the ball a whole lot. So that's a lot of concern for Adam Troutman. Not a guy that I'm really targeting, even though he's been touted as a sleeper by many. Gerald Everett, kind of same thing as I talked about with Tyler Higbee. How many targets can we expect this guy to get competing with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett? I do think the offense is going to be good. I do think Russell Wilson's going to be good, obviously, but the inline percentage, we're not really sure. They used Greg Olsen a lot in the slot last year, which is really weird. But Gerald Everett has that versatility if they want to use him in a variety of ways. He's a guy that I am kind of targeting in this late round tight end area, but not a guy that has probably a very high ceiling given the fact that he has to compete with those top 2 receivers. Evan Ingram, I'm just not even drafting the guy. Like he had 100, like he had the 4th most targets in the NFL last year and did absolutely diddly squat with them. He was the like 23rd tight end in points per game last year, despite seeing 100 targets. Like you have to be some levels of inefficient to do that. I know he didn't score a lot of touchdowns, but with Kenny Golladay coming into town, with Saquon Barkley back, are we expecting Evan Ingram to score more touchdowns than he scored last year without those guys in the offense? The offense will be better, sure, but Daniel Jones is not a guy that's going to throw 40 touchdowns. He's probably only going to throw like 22 touchdowns. So if Kenny Golladay gets 6 or 7 of those and you got to sparingly throw in Saquon Barkley and other receivers in there, like Evan Ingram's touchdown ceiling is what, like 4 or 5 touchdowns? I just don't think he's a very good fantasy pick in general. Tight end 17 to 24, and I'll just really run through these ones quick. Jonnu Smith, Cole Kmet, Blake Jarwin are guys that are interesting because they have a lot of question marks, but it should be a relatively good situation. Jonnu Smith specifically is a guy that I'm targeting because he has the potential to become the 1st or 2nd target in his offense, given the amount of money he was paid and given the lack of receiving talent that's there. And if Mac Jones starts, then we know that this offense is actually going to produce a lot more from a passing perspective. Whereas if Cam Newton starts, it's going to be a rushing offense, and that might hurt Jonnu Smith, especially in the red zone where he made a lot of his money last year. And Cole Kmet, Jimmy Graham there or not, I still think Cole Kmet's a guy that can become the 2nd target in this offense. It'll be an uphill battle for him. And if Jimmy Graham gets cut, I imagine his ADP will just completely fly up the charts. But I do really like Cole Kmet this year as a late round guy. Rob Gronkowski and Jared Cook are veteran sleepers that I think are going totally undervalued. I would straight up rather have Rob Gronkowski and Jared Cook than Mike Gesicki right now, who's tight end 11 in ADP. So those guys are, if I'm going to deploy a strategy, and I'll talk about this later in the video, and I'm going to grab a breakout candidate plus a veteran sleeper candidate, I think Jonnu Smith and Rob Gronkowski or something like that, if you're going to fade the tight end position, is a great way to do that. Hunter Henry, kind of same things as Jonnu Smith. I'm not really sure how that split is going to work out, but I do prefer Jonnu to Hunter Henry, so I give the lean to him there. Blake Jarwin, as I talked about with Cole Kmet and Jonnu Smith, another guy that is in a good offense. He's like 4th target in the offense, 5th target maybe. So it's going to be inconsistent for him, similar to what I said for Irv Smith, but it's going to be a great offense. They're going to throw the ball a lot. So he's definitely going to be a great streaming option for you at the very minimum. And then Anthony Ferkser, Austin Hooper, guys that had pretty good usage last year, just didn't really produce that much. Again, guys that are probably the 3rd targets in their offense, but they could have some good streaming weeks. They could be valuable for fantasy. And when we look at what this exercise spit out, basically, when we want to look at the green, yellow, orange, red matrix that I talked about with the other 3 positions, you can see that there's a lot of green early in the draft and there's a lot of red late in the draft, which is exactly what I expected to happen because it's a very top-heavy position. We know that the top 3 tight ends, top 6 tight ends are the cream of the crop this year. I lowered the thresholds for tight ends just a bit because it's a shallow position. So before, anything in green, yellow, orange, and red was a lot more favored to positive numbers. Like if you had a positive score in this area, you were yellow or green. But I actually gave orange scores, which is more of a boomer bust type of scores, to anybody that had -20 to 0. So if they were negative, but they weren't extremely negative, I gave them a boomer bust score because I think with the tight end position, you just never know what's going to happen. You never know who's going to break out that year, and you never know how target distribution is going to be dissected. So there's a lot more guys with an orange score than there would have been if I kept those initial thresholds that I had for running backs and wide receivers. I wish there was a more exciting and more revolutionary outcome to this, but it seems this year, the takeaway from this video, that if you want to, this is the important part of the video, right? Like how to approach tight ends this year in fantasy. I think early tight end is the play. I know it's a very lazy thing, but it's better to go into an exercise thinking that's the play and prove yourself right than go into it and then not do it at all and think that early tight end is the play. When in fact, if I went into this and a different outcome came out, then I would have been like, oh shit, I missed an opportunity to grab late tight ends because it might've been more optimal this year. But my suspicion was early tight end was going to be the play. It proved to be that way. And I think specifically one thing that I want to draw your attention to is tight ends 4 to 6. Kyle Pitts, Mark Andrews, TJ Hawkinson. Those guys are very enticing to me. And I tweeted this last offseason talking about breakout tight ends and late round tight ends. But if you look at percentage of tight ends on playoff rosters, usually it's these elite guys, right? 2018, we had George Kittle, Eric Ebron, Jared Cook. 2019, Darren Waller, Andrews, and Hooper. The common denominator, obviously, with Kittle and Waller were that they were being drafted really late going into those seasons. George Kittle hadn't broken out until 2018. Darren Waller hadn't broken out until 2019. So the fact that they were the highest owned tight ends on playoff rosters, and same goes for Andrews and Hooper and Ebron and Cook. Those guys were all late round options. Travis Kelce was the only guy that ranked among those guys who was an early round tight end that year. So you definitely can find value late in the draft. So unfortunately, I don't see a massive breakout candidate late in drafts like I saw for guys like TJ Hawkinson last year, and I saw for guys like Noah Fant last year, who was a pretty awesome tight end for fantasy, and I saw for guys even like Logan Thomas, who we heard a lot of buzz about. So you're gonna have to keep your eyes open this time in the offseason once we get into training camps. Who's performing, who's impressing. If we hear things like Gerald Everett's going off and Gerald Everett looks great, then he might be this year's breakout tight end, or, vice versa with Jonnu Smith or any of these other guys. But unfortunately, I think if you're going to want a great tight end this year, you're going to have to take him early. And securing a top 6 option at the position, as I mentioned, or fading the position and trying to grab a few guys late that you think can break out is probably the most optimal play this year. Based on the way I view the position, I would probably grab a solid veteran sleeper option, like I said, with Jared Cook and Rob Gronkowski, and pair them with a breakout candidate like Gerald Everett, like Jonnu Smith, if I'm fading the position. But if I'm not fading the position, the guys that I really like at the top of the draft at value currently are Darren Waller, who are going, late second, early third round of drafts, and Andrews and Mark Andrews and TJ Hawkinson, who are going about round 6 in value. So of the top 6 tight ends, those are the 3 that I'm targeting the most, because I think they present the best value, because I don't think George Kittle is worth a late second round pick. I as much as I think Travis Kelce is worth where he's going, I'm just not willing to pull the trigger over some of those elite running backs compared to where you have to take Travis Kelce. And generally speaking, you have to take Travis Kelce late first round, early second round. And that's a pretty tough pill to swallow for me, because I don't want to pass on guys like Antonio Gibson. I don't want to pass on guys like Jonathan Taylor and like Zeke Elliott. Like, I can't pass on those guys for a tight end. I just can't physically do it. So to me, the value presents itself at the late third, or the late second round, early third round with Darren Waller. And then in the 5th, 6th round with Mark Andrews and TJ Hawkinson. And with Kyle Pitts, I like where he's going. I just think you're drafting him where you should be drafting him. I don't think he's like a value or anything necessarily. And I don't think he's overvalued. I think he's properly valued where he should be going. So that's basically my strategy for the tight end position. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you guys took a lot away from that. I know I spent a lot of time on a position that usually gets ignored in fantasy, but it's an important position nonetheless, because if you do hit on a tight end position and you get an every week starter out of it, it's going to really help your chances to make the playoffs in your league, because chances are only 3 or 4 teams in every 12-man league are going to have a solidified tight end week in and week out. And usually it's guys like Kelce and it's guys like Kittle. So if there's, Kelce, Kittle, Waller this year, and one more guy breaks into that elite stratosphere, then that guy that broke into that elite stratosphere is likely going to have seen a big return on investment from where they were drafted. So if you guys did enjoy that, like, comment, subscribe, comment down below, which tight end are you currently targeting at value? Like I just said, I'm targeting Hawkinson, Andrews, and Waller at value right now. Who are you? Are you really in on Kittle? Are you really in on Kelce? Are you really in on Hawkinson and Andrews like me? Comment down below who you really like based on ADP. And if you received some value from this video and you want to support us, go ahead and head on over to underdogfantasy.com. It is a best ball site where you can do best ball drafts. Basically, all you do is draft. You don't have to set your lineup week in and week out. You can enter $5, $10, $3, $25 potential GPP tournaments that you can win $1 million in, like Best Ball Mania 2. And you can get a lot of good drafting practice for your home leagues drafts this year. And you can also win some money in the process. And if you use promo code FSE when you sign up and deposit a minimum of $10, you will get $25 on top of your initial deposit to play with. And you will also get both of our draft guides totally for free. So all you have to do is spend $10 on a site that you can win money with that $10 with. You'll get $25 on top of it. Plus you'll get 2 draft guides for free. You'll also have a chance to be entered into our listener redraft league. Anybody who uses our code will be entered into a chance to be in our listener redraft league. So if you want a chance to be in the league with me and Danny, here's your chance to do that. Peace out, guys, and enjoy your Thursday.
Why you need the money?